Welcome everyone to our first Zoom call of the year. This is following on from our year of the bird of prey in 2020. We've decided to make 2021 the year of the migrant, and this is the first talk on that. Katheryn Finney is with us today. She's the project manager for the Irish Breeding Curlew Project. She's going to tell us about her work in that field, and also what the project, the hopes and outcomes for that project. It's a very timely talk as well, might I add. I originally became involved with with Birdwatch Ireland back in 2009 after reading about the plight of the curlew and the falling numbers of that curlew, of that population of bird in Ireland, and it was through that I actually met Katheryn working on a project in the Shannon Callows in Banagher, where she was working to develop a system for farmers to use to protect wetland birds. I worked on that project for 3 years, and it was a real eye-opener, the level of physical work involved in terms of conservation. I was just discussing this with Katheryn before the call, that in light of the recent report that came out last week, where it showed Ireland has now added more birds to the red list of endangered species, possibly the change in use of language might be, instead of conservation, we should be talking about extinction prevention, because really, if I look at the situation or the plight of the curlew in the context of where I started with Birdwatch Ireland back in 2009, that bird really should be extinct by now. And if it weren't for the efforts of Birdwatch Ireland, it certainly would be extinct. So I think in light of that, maybe a new sort of discussion should be had around that language, because I always felt that conservation was a word that reassured people that things were, happening to ensure that bird survived, and that is true to a certain extent, but the level of effort involved, the level of intrusion into that species like ecology that needs to take place is so dramatic that the only context for doing anything as intrusive like that would be if the bird was critically endangered. And so I think in that context, the term extinction prevention, should I say, is something a bit more apt. But again, I'll let Katheryn talk about that, and also the project that she's involved with. She's going to talk for a half an hour, and at the end of that, we can open it up to the floor to ask any questions. You can also put your comments in the chat as well, if you don't wish to speak on the video. As I said, this is being recorded, but the questions and answer section won't be. So with that, I'll let Katheryn Finney begin, and I'll stop talking.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. I should probably start with saying, first of all, I've been working for Birdwatch Ireland for the past 16 years. I've always worked on breeding waders. It's probably a tribute to Paul that he still speaks to me, because the project he's talking about, having volunteered on, we erected the first anti-predator fox and mink-proof fence for conservation uses on an island. It was nearly 4 kilometers long, and it needed to be maintained every year. So I quite literally had himself and myself and a lot of other volunteers crawling around the island looking for holes. So when he talks about very physical work, it's a tribute to Paul that he's still speaking to me after putting him through that. Just to give you a bit of background to me, I'm an agri-environmental specialist. I specialise in scheme design, so I design and trial agri-environmental schemes to be put into the National Agri-Environmental Programme in the likes of RBAPS or GLOS, and also trying to kind of develop innovative solutions to stem some of these declines. I just want to start the talk. Before I start the talk, some of you are probably, a lot of you are probably members, and some of you may be aware that Nick, our CEO, has sadly passed away. So just before I start, I'd like to kind of pay tribute to Nick. He was an absolutely wonderful conservationist, and he was an absolutely lovely man. He was really well liked by the staff. And although he was only really with the organisation a very short time, he made a tremendous impact on the staff in that time. And he sadly fought very, very hard to get back to us. He had a vision for what he would like to have worked with and what he would like to have, where he would like to have brought the organisation, and sadly, that didn't work out for him. So we've just announced it this afternoon on our Facebook page and Twitter. So just some of you may already be aware, but yeah, it just it's kind of difficult. He was a lovely man. So just to kind of pay tribute to him. So I suppose just to start, when I first started working on breeding waders in 2005, curlew and lapwing were red listed, and redshank and snipe were both amber listed. They are all now red listed birds of conservation concern, which means they're all kind of critically endangered. And that's just occurred in 16 years, and that's with the likes of you know, we have known that these birds are in trouble for a long time, and we've been championing for their cause for a very long time. Sadly, they're not just red listed. Curlew are faced with extinction. The Eurasian curlew is classified as near threatened with extinction, and is potentially facing extinction in Ireland in the next 10 to 15 years if we can't stem the declines. Lapwing is very close behind, and as our snipe and redshank are not that far behind that. So it is really, as Paul kind of put it, it's a really critical point in time that we are at the present. And it just in discussion, I mean, I think it's really interesting, and I would have always considered, when I entered work with Birdwatch Ireland, I considered I was entering work as a conservationist, but really actually I have somehow, and he's right, I've morphed into a extinction preventionist, because effectively working with curlew, they are that close to extinction at present. And it's something I quite often describe to say funders or kind of stakeholders when I'm trying to kind of explain the measures that we need to now employ in order to try and save these species, is that these species are now, they are, as you would consider, a intensive care patient, and that a general surgeon, if you're going to send someone in to operate on them, a general surgeon will not suffice. You need a specialist, and you need a specialist surgeon, and they're in intensive care, and the type of medicine that you need to employ to save them is going to be a completely different ball game to the type of medicine that you would need if you were kind of just, you know, looking after a general patient. So yeah, it can be, there is a lot to do, but there's a lot of positivity as well. So I just want to start, because sometimes we talk about these birds, and I've very much had the privilege of working with them in a very hands-on way in terms of both their management and research. And I've seen their life cycle right from the start, and many people haven't even seen pictures of it. So I thought I'd just start by showing you some pictures of the life cycle of some of these species, because they're just, it's nice to see. I thought it'd be nice to uplift, have a bit of an uplifting moment. Let's just go back to that. But here we have they're all breeding waders, lapwing, redshank, curlew and snipe. They are, and of course golden plover, which breeds kind of very in localized populations. They're all ground nesting bird species. So that's just a picture of lapwing eggs, lapwing chick. They're kind of self-feeding. Once they hatch, the chicks just leave the nest cup and they are responsible for looking after themselves. So it just kind of gives you an idea of their life cycle of a lapwing. That's redshank. Redshank like to nest in, whereas lapwing nest on kind of bare ground, they like really short grass. Redshank will nest in like little tussocks and hide their nest in a tussock. As you can see, like just when those chicks, they're literally they're less than a day old. So just adorable little fluffy things. And the same with curlew again. They're just little balls of fluff with big long legs. They're just absolutely kind of adorable. And just back to the picture before that, like I suppose people don't really, or a lot of people are only starting to realise how critically endangered our breeding waders are in Ireland. And a part of the problem, or part of the reason for that, is that we get huge numbers of birds from Northern Europe, Scandinavia, that come to Ireland specifically for winter, to overwinter here because we're a nice mild climate. So quite often you'll see these birds in quite large numbers, especially lapwing, golden plover and other waders. You'll see them in pretty large numbers, and they look like they're really abundant, and that there's nothing going wrong with them. But it's important to note that a lot of those birds are actually, they're international visitors that have come here to just spend the winter here. When they go back to their breeding grounds as a European population, when they start to disperse back to their breeding grounds and across Europe, you see how stark the population levels really are. And of course, they're critically in decline in Ireland. So although there's, we do have some knowledge gaps with curlew and other breeding waders, but we do know an awful lot about them. And just to run you through what we do know about them. We know the curlew breeding season. It mirrors the rest of those breeding wader species. They largely start nesting in about April. They're on eggs. And then sometime in around early May to kind of middle of June, the chicks hatch. And then it's about another kind of month and the fledglings will fledge. Hopefully, and that's what you plan for. So they're a ground nesting species, as I mentioned. The chicks are self-feeding. So once all 4 chicks have hatched, they actually leave the nest cup and they never go back to that nest cup again. And they're responsible for feeding themselves. The adults brood them when the weather is bad or the weather is poor or cold, and they'll lead them to kind of good feeding spots, and they'll also keep a watch out for predators, but they're not responsible for feeding them. So they really are kind of tough little things, and they're up against it from day one. They breed in a range of habitats. So they're classified as a farmland bird and a bird of the uplands. They breed on unimproved, semi-improved pasture, upland and lowland bogs, wet grassland and kind of uplands. In the UK, curlew are found breeding on arable land. In Ireland, we have no records of curlew breeding in arable land in Ireland, so they don't tend to breed in arable land over here. The sword height is very important. They like a mixed sword height. Curlew, a bit like redshank, will often hide their nest in a patch of long vegetation, but they don't necessarily, and they will nest in meadows, but they don't always kind of like to, kind of vast expanse of long grasses, because they like to be able to see the predators coming. So effectively, their anti-predator strategy is to vacate the nest or leave the nest when they see a predator maybe 300-400 meters away, they'll leave their nest, and it makes it really difficult for the predator to actually pinpoint the location of that nest, because as it moves towards where it thinks it was, their sense of perspective changes, and it can be really difficult. And I know this intimately because I've had to actually search for curlew and other wader nests as part of the research project, and your sense of perspective, you can be miles off by the time you get to where you think that that nest was meant to be. But also it's very important for the chicks, because as I said, the chicks are self-feeding and they feed on ground-dwelling invertebrates. And in order to find those ground-dwelling invertebrates, if the grass is very thick or dense or long, they can't easily find the food that they need to find. And also, if it's very thick and dense and long, there are tiny little things. They end up expending so much energy just trying to move through the sward that, you know, that it's a waste of their energy that they should be using to grow and keep warm. So it's really important both for the adults in terms of their anti-predator behavior, and also for the chicks in terms of their feeding. Curlew, like other breeding waders, do not like trees or scrub. Now that's not to say that you won't find a curlew nesting beside a patch of trees or scrub, and possibly of all the wader species, it's most likely to nest close to scrub or trees. But as a general rule of thumb, they don't like it because it leaves them far, far more vulnerable to depredation or to predation by predators. We have a general rule of thumb, 50 meters from a tree or a hedge or a bush, they don't like it, and it shouldn't be there, and they shouldn't be there. The adults need soft mud for probing, so they use their big long bill to kind of probe into the earth and eat the ground-dwelling invertebrates. And they also need kind of in their areas, they either need kind of a damp pasture, kind of slightly wet underfoot, or shallow pools that are kind of rich in invertebrates. And that's important for the chick feeding. And if you just think about it from the very perspective of, you think about a kind of a muddy pothole in the middle of summer, where it's got kind of the water is evaporating and you've got lots of damp muddy bits at the side, they're always full of insects, and that's just brilliant feeding for the chicks. So that's what they need, either kind of a high water table or nice damp areas for feeding. Unfortunately, as I said, these birds are critically in decline. They're in decline right across the range in Europe, and particularly so in Ireland. It's quite a stark trend right across, so much so that, as I said, they have been added to the near threatened list, the INCU near threatened list, which basically means the Eurasian curlew is near threatened with extinction. So I think that's effectively, the same status as the giant panda and the Bengal tiger, and we never really think of our own species in Ireland as being that critically endangered. And certainly you could probably say to a lot of school children about the giant panda, and they know that it's endangered, but do they know that the curlew is endangered? So I suppose there's a body of work in that alone. Back in the atlases, we've undergone huge catastrophic design. So each of these dots was a record, a breeding curlew record, back in the 1972 atlas, and they're estimated to be kind of in and around 8,000 pairs. By the 93 atlas, there was only about 2,000 pairs. And the last atlas, which was the 2011 atlas, there was 180 pairs. So the declines were absolutely catastrophic. And on the back of that atlas, MPWS commissioned a national survey between 2015 and 2017 to try and really pinpoint exactly where these birds were and how many of them were left. And the results were absolutely stark and quite shocking, and just overall just really depressing. I suppose it had confirmed our worst fears in Birdwatch Ireland, that these birds were really, really in serious decline. And what they found in the national surveys, there was a total of 135 pairs left in the Republic of Ireland. So you're really talking, in a time period of kind of 30 to 40 years, you've gone from 8,000 pairs to 135 pairs. So these birds really are, at a national level, facing extinction if we don't manage to stem the declines. 63% are occurring on bog sites. So you can see those scattered across the country. 28% are still on farmland, and 9% are on wet grassland. And just the project that I work on, the Curlew EIP, it's a multi-partnership project. It's a European innovation project, and it's funded by the Department of Agriculture. And the whole objective of the Curlew EIP is to design agri-environmental solutions to these declines. And we're currently operating in two distinct areas. We're operating in the South Leitrim Bogs area to try and see, to trial the solutions in a bog kind of landscape, a bog and kind of agricultural landscape up there, and then a wet grassland landscape and farmland landscape in Lough Corrib. 56% of them are on designated sites. Or the last remaining pairs are on designated sites, such as Lough Corrib is a designated site. This does not necessarily, these are just, these Natura sites, they are still the bastions of biodiversity, because in many cases, like of Lough Corrib, seasonally flooded wet grassland, Shannon Callows again, seasonally flooded wet grassland. They're areas that haven't managed, they're not they haven't suffered from the same intensification and the same pressures that other areas nationally have suffered from. So biodiversity has hung on there when it's maybe been eliminated from the wider countryside. Unfortunately, although they are occurring on designated sites, they're not the qualifying interest for any of the designated sites nationally. So very often, when it comes to a Natura site, there are qualifying interests, and those qualifying interests are the reasons those sites were designated, and they have to meet certain criteria. But and although Curlew probably meet a lot of the criteria, or meet the criteria on most of them, it would mean a whole legislative redesignation in a lot of cases, and it's just simply, that's a massive undertaking on every level. So at the moment, they're actually not a designated feature on any site nationally, which can sometimes cause problems in terms of what we are able to and what we can do for them, or the lengths that we have to go to in order to negotiate works that we want to do on these sites for Curlew, because we have to demonstrate that it's not going to adversely affect a feature in that designation that is a qualifying interest, even if that other feature or that other species or that other habitat is fairly widespread and not anywhere as critical as Curlew. So I suppose it's a stark picture, really. I suppose why the declines are so severe, it really comes down to two things, and two things only. It's loss and fragmentation of Curlew breeding habitat, and an increase of predation of nests and chicks. And they are the two factors which have started the declines in them and are now absolutely driving their declines. Changes in agricultural practices. In the last 30, 40 years, agricultural practices have changed dramatically. You have huge drainage and reseeding of grassland, and you'll see, just to give an idea of fertilizer use in Ireland between the 1960s and the 2000s, it's increased dramatically, and that fertilizer usage graph tends to mirror the graph for drainage and reseeding. 25,000 hectares of agricultural land has been drained, and this is all kind of small scale drainage. Land abandonment in some areas is a real problem. Again, these are farmland birds, So they are dependent on farm enterprises. It's not just a case that you can sort of leave them to a field and walk away and let nature take its course, because in Ireland, nature takes its course in one direction and one direction only, and that's afforestation eventually. And for a lot of species, an awful lot of species, both habitats and bird species, this is not actually a good thing. They have evolved with traditional agriculture, and they, which has been practiced in Ireland for, thousands of years. In other areas, overgrazing is a real problem, and burning of the uplands. It's quite a topical. It's always this time of year. It's really, really topical. Birds are down on nests at the moment. Any bird species that's a ground nesting bird species, and the hills or the bogs are on fire, it's catastrophic for them. And we've also got land use change, and what the impact of land use change is, it leads to either direct loss of habitat or kind of a complete fragmentation of habitat, or a habitat that basically they have tipped the balance on, and they have made the influence of maybe predation have a much greater effect. So, I mean, these are just some of the findings that wind farm development, that there was no recovery in the first year post-construction. So if a curlew was displaced from a wind farm site in the first year after construction, the first year post-construction, they didn't tend to come back. And I suppose it's important to say, although curlew can vary, or can kind of, their breeding habitat can be quite large and they're very difficult to pin down, they're also, like all breeding waders, they're very site faithful. So they tend to come back to the same breeding ground every year. Maybe not to the exact place, but quite often they can come back to exactly the same field. And I've seen curlew return to the same area of the same field year on year on year. It doesn't mean that they won't abandon it if it's getting really, if it's really not working for them, they can abandon it. But largely they're site faithful. And of course, they're very long, all breeding waders, they're very long-lived birds. So they live for about 15 years, which can also make it look like the population is relatively stable when it's not. Because if you're just doing a population count and you're going out and you're counting 135 birds every year for 6 years, it works fine for a number of years, and then eventually that tranche of the population die off, and what you tend to have is you have a graph that goes like that and that. It drops off a cliff, and that's kind of the nature of all breeding waders, including curlew, because they are long-lived. So population counting is not always it doesn't always tell the full picture of what's been happening with them. So just back to the land use and loss fragmentation of habitat, the edge effect. So forests support crows and foxes, and they support high densities of these. And in fact, these predators are increasing at a national level. Their populations, there's a lot of evidence. Certainly the corvids, crows, have absolutely increased, and that's been demonstrated by the atlases. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest the fox numbers are increasing as well. But these forests, they provide ample suitable habitat for these predator species. And it's been found that open ground within a kilometre or more of forestry plantations are more likely curlew have faced increased predation pressure within a kilometre of that forest edge. So anywhere on the edge, it's a kilometre. The impacts of that forest last for a kilometre. So when you take that into account, in a lot of areas, there's not a huge number of really open areas, and you start dropping forestry into the middle of it, and you can suddenly wipe out a huge element of suitable habitat for these birds, and make any birds that are there far, far, far more vulnerable to predation. And again, bogs are incredibly important habitats for curlew. They're one of the most important habitats left for curlew, and a lot of that is, some of them, you know, because you still have pockets of boglands that are kind of, they're not being intensively managed, even though we have lost an awful lot of them. And just to give you an example, like 90% of raised bogs, 72% of blanket bogs have been lost to commercial extraction. So again, a lot of that has taken place in the last 40 years. So that's a catastrophic decline and change. I mean, I don't think humans would adapt to a change that catastrophic in our ecosystem in the same time frame. Many of the bogs, as I've mentioned, that we are working on, they are not designated, so that while some of the bogs that curlew are occurring on are NHAs, they're not NHAs for curlew, and other bogs that we are working on, they're not designated at all, so they're afforded no additional legal protection outside of the Wildlife Act, even though there is a critically endangered species relying on it. And obviously that is something that through both my work on this project and our work with Birdwatch Ireland, we are advocating strongly that needs to change. And in addition to that, you've got non-commercial extraction, and that tends to take place, you know, right at peak nesting time. So the timing of turf cutting coincides with the timing of breeding. So it can cause disturbance. And unfortunately, while curlew can be very, very secretive, especially when they're on eggs, as soon as they hatch chicks, they're very vocal and they're very obvious as to where they are, because they're effectively go up into the air and they are calling their chicks away from them, leading their chicks away. So it also acts as a marker to anything or any predator there, that there's a curlew there and it has chicks and it's worth searching that area. So not alone does the bird expend energy and the chicks expend energy running around, like trying to get out of the way of danger, it also is alerting predators to their presence. And the predators do know what that means and they do key into it. And you will very often see on some of these sites a curlew go up and call, and out of nowhere you'll see corvids or grey crows or magpie swoop in and start following where the sound came from and start looking for the curlew. So it's a very really disturbance, and putting the birds up is a very real danger for curlew. Again, like government policies, I mean, a lot of these government policies, they're very welcome. They're expanding the number of wind farms and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. But there needs to be really well thought out and properly targeted plans. And that really needs to be taken into account, not just for curlew, but for other biodiversity as well. You know, some of these technologies are just not compatible with some habitats or some species. So it's important that, you know, these policies are adequately targeted. Again, increased forest cover. I mean, they're absolutely, you know, it's a welcome thing. You know, plant more trees. Who could go? You know, who would be against that? And certainly we aren't. But again, they really need to be targeted properly. And unfortunately, as is the case, many of the farmers that are planting forestry, or many of the areas where these forestation grants are targeted, tend to be these less economic areas of the countryside from an agricultural perspective. But these less economical areas from an agricultural perspective tend to be, and largely are, the high nature value farmland areas. And by the term high nature value farmland, we mean it is farmland, it's farmed environment, but it's low intensity farming, it's unintensive, and it quite often supports quite you know, very good kind of examples of habitats or species that aren't found in the wider countryside. So they're biodiversity wise, they can be very, very rich areas. So it would be an absolute travesty for a whole host of both plants and species if these areas are just covered in forestry, because you would see huge biodiversity loss on the back of that. And so again, because they tend not to be economical for an agricultural point of view, and because the national policy is to increase the level of forestation, they tend to be kind of pushed into these areas, and there needs to be more thought in relation to this. And certainly both kind of Birdwatch Ireland and many other organisations working in the agri-environmental sphere are constantly advocating for the fact that these high nature value farmland areas are incredibly rich in biodiversity and need to be protected, and farmers need to be encouraged and support to farm them in a non-intensive way and a sustainable manner. Food Harvest 2020, it's a lot of this is related to the advisory services for agriculture in this country. It's still very much a productionist model of approach. There is very little advisory in relation to farmers farming in a high nature value area, where it's about kind of sustainability and about kind of maximizing profits while farming in a sustainable manner. A lot of the advice tends to be targeted or, for more intensive agriculture, and it seems to be this sort of kind of one message fits all for the entire country, which is reseed, increase your fertilizer usage, drain. But we have to remember, and this is something obviously we also advocate with, food is not the only agricultural produce. And we as consumers, we also have a part to play in that. We need to value that, that when we are buying agricultural produce, we need to value the fact that there is also a free good coming with that, which is our biodiversity and our landscape, and it needs to be valued. So another touching on this, there has been an increase in predator populations. So I suppose to start with, habitat loss and fragmentation is generally the causing factor of population declines. It nearly always, very few examples where it is not the start. It always starts with habitat loss and fragmentation. But this in itself can make populations more vulnerable to predation. And through those kind of loss of nests and chicks, you then have this snowball effect where the population is declining. And if you look at it, take it from this point of view, predation has always occurred. But if you have a healthy and sustainable population, for instance, if you have 100 people in a room, and if I was to knock out 10% of you, realistically, without counting and doing a head count, you probably wouldn't really notice that 10% of you have been knocked off. However, I put 10 of you in a room and I knock out 10% of you, you're going to notice that person is missing. So it's effectively the exact same thing with populations. When a population starts to decrease, it automatically makes it more vulnerable, because every individual that you lose to predation from that population has a much bigger impact on the sustainability of that population and the ability for that population to recover. So on top of that, we also have an increase in predator numbers. And now predation is one of the major, and probably is the major driving cause of the decline in curlew currently, and in other breeding waders, and actually, quite to be honest, a host of other ground nesting bird species. So it is a really significant problem at this point. And just simply, there are so few birds left that it cannot sustain. There is no healthy level of depredation or predation anymore, that it just simply can't sustain it. We know what the productivity needs to be for a population to remain stable. So currently, in the last 5 years, the productivity of breeding curlew in Ireland has been in the region of about 0.1 to 0.5. We need a productivity, and that's kind of the number of young fledged per pair. We need a productivity of between nearly 0.5 and 0.6 for the population to remain stable. That's just stable. That's not increasing. That's just stable. So it is it is, I suppose, this kind of looking at this now just reminds me of the R number. I suppose everybody knows how the significance of the R number going from 0.8 to 1 is. It's effectively the same with this. It doesn't look like a huge jump, but it's really, really, really hard to get these birds to even a sustainable productivity rate at the moment. The Curlew EP, I touched on before, we're like working together with farmers to develop local solutions. As I said, it's multi-partnership project. Birdwatch Ireland are the lead partner, Teagasc are partners, the Irish Mature Hill Farmers Association are partners, and the Irish Grey Partridge Trust. As I said, it's funded through the European Innovation Project through the Department of Agriculture. So it's all about trying to develop these agri-environmental solutions that can be put into the next agri-environmental schemes. And key to that work is working with farmers. And I have to say, I've been working with farmers now for the last 16 years, and they are tremendously willing to partake in these trials. And partaking in a trial agri-environmental scheme, it should be, you know, it really needs, it's very often not talked about, but I could change the management agreement that farmer is involved in. I could change it and tweak it every year until I get a kind of a one that I find works. So that means from year to year, the farmer actually doesn't really know what he's going to be allowed to do on that field, or what that enterprise is going to have. And if you take back, like most farmers, you know, their enterprises start 2 years beforehand. There's a time lag. So, you know, they have calves. They don't sell them until they're like 2.5. So there's a tremendous, they have been absolutely willing, fabulous to work with. I've rarely met a farmer that you just is not interested or you can't work with. A lot of them are naturally interested. They wouldn't be in farming if they weren't interested in in nature. But they are very much driven by policy and by trying to make a living, and it is a very difficult kind of industry to make a living in, and the policies don't support them the way they should to farm in a way that many of them would naturally prefer to farm in. And that's where agri-environmental schemes are so important, because it provides these farmers with an alternative to farm sustainability. And I suppose I was at a talk once, and one of the farmers stood up and said, I'm too in the red to be in the green in terms of my farming practices. So if you take those farmers and you offer them the ability to actually to kind of farm in a more sustainable manner without driving them into the red, I have found they jump at it. And they've been really, really great. So the scheme that we've devised, it is a results-based scheme. Some of you will know what this means, but effectively in a results-based scheme, we have devised a number of things that the habitat on their field is scored against. And how well the farmer achieves, or how much the farmer is paid, depends on how well they produce that habitat. So if they do a really poor job at it and they don't really put very much effort in, then they get a low field score, and then they get a lower payment rate. If they put a lot of effort in, they follow all our advice, and they work at it, and they get a really, really nice habitat on their field, they'll get a higher score and a higher payment rate. So this is a very new type of agri-environmental scheme. It's very much farmers are very much supported by specialist advisors, and a specialist advisor in premises is to help the farmer achieve their ends, to help them achieve their high score, and they can kind of contact us at any time. So part of the program, we're working with farmers to create curlew habitat. It is optional but incentivized. So this will be where there's limited wet features for the chicks, we might put some in, or we'll remove scrub and predator habitat. So we're trialing kind of habitat improvement works on their land. We're also working with them in predator management. So as I kind of mentioned, the removal of predator habitat can be a real effective way to reduce the predation impact on breeding curlew in the area. And we're also hoping to trial the use of temporary electric fences around nest sites. So this is where we can locate the nest site. We will put up an electric fence, and at least for a month, at least until the chicks hatch, we have protected it from predation until that point. Obviously, once they hatch, they leave, and then they're vulnerable to predation again. But we're also trialing new technologies. Curlew nests are particularly difficult to locate. They're very secretive early in the breeding season, and you really want to, and at the nesting stage, and you really want to get in there at the nesting stage so you can offer them some protection. So this year in the project, we are going to be fishing some birds with satellite tags. And this is mirroring some work that NPWS are also doing. So combined, we will pool our results, and we will have an idea of how birds are using their sites, and how birds, and fill in some of the knowledge gaps that we have in relation to curlew on a national scale and across a variety of habitats. And I'm also going to trial the use of a night vision drone now this is it's not your normal drone, this is a very high spec drone, to see if we can actually locate heat signatures of curlew nests, because a drone technology of this, like if you have an area like South Leitrim Bogs area where we've got maybe 6 or 7 bogs interspersed by agricultural land, we know that there are birds on some of those bogs, but we don't know where they are. You can cover effectively all of those bogs in half an afternoon or half a night. And if you can get a GPS location, it allows you to go straight in and fence that nest in a very non-invasive and with causing very little disturbance. So we'll see. It hasn't been done in Ireland thus far before. It has been used, I think, last year for the first time in the UK. So we'll see how, I'm excited to see how that works, because it could revolutionise how we locate curlew nests to fence. So just to wrap up this is where we are now. So now we're in the region nationally from 135 pairs. We're in the region of kind of 3 to 26 chicks per year. We need 50 chicks a year for the population to remain stable. And all we need is 60 chicks a year for the population to start really dramatically increasing. So I suppose we're working really hard to get there. And surely, I mean, it would be an absolute travesty if we can't manage to get to a point where we can save these species from extinction. But we do need a whole host of factors, from funding to political will, and to the right policies in the right places. Just to leave you with this year, NPWS, because the picture is so stark for breeding curlew, they are carrying out another national curlew survey in 2021. So if you have curlew in your area, or you see breeding curlew anywhere, you can notify them through this email address or through this phone number, and they can verify that record. So it's kind of do please feed in any records that you may have in relation to curlew. All right, thank you very much.